Hi everyone! In this video, we're going to be working on identifying fractions. Our essential question is, how do I use shapes and equal parts? I can describe a whole by the number of equal parts, including 2/2, 3/3, and 4/4. We're going to start off with a little bit of review. If you haven't already watched Ms. Gullett's video, please go and watch that first. So yesterday in Ms. Gullett's video, we worked on halves. A half is when you partition or divide an object into two equal parts. Here are an example of halves. The circled shapes are examples of not halves. You can see that the heart and the triangle are not split into two even parts. And the star isn't even split into parts. It's just an example of one whole. All right, today we're going to be working on thirds and fourths. So thirds, when something is divided or partitioned into thirds, how many equal parts or shares does it have? If something is partitioned into thirds, it has 3 equal parts or shares. Here are 2 ways to partition a rectangle into thirds. Let's shade in 1/3 of the rectangle. What do you notice? Even though these examples look different, they are both thirds of the whole shape. Notice how each part is equal. Let's color in each third and count as we go. 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, or 1 whole. Take a look at these rectangles. Which part is larger? Which has more parts, halves or thirds? Thirds has more parts, but the parts are smaller. The more times you cut the rectangle, the smaller the pieces. So that means our rectangle that is divided or partitioned into 2 equal parts, that shaded piece is larger than our thirds piece is. Let's try it with circles. 1/2 is more than 1/3. 1/2 is greater because there are only 2 parts. 1/3 is smaller because we cut the circle into more pieces. Fourths. If something is partitioned into fourths, how many equal parts or shares does it have? If something is partitioned into fourths, it has 4 equal parts or shares. Here are ways to partition rectangles and circles into fourths. Let's practice. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, or 1 whole. Fractions in our lives. It's easy to think of food when we talk about fractions. There are so many foods we cut up to share with family and friends. When you share food with family and friends, you want to have the same amount as the person that you are sharing with. So you need to make sure that you are partitioning your food into equal parts or shares. Fractions to wholes. If this is 1/2, what do I need to make it a whole? I would need to add another 1/2 to make it a whole. 2 halves make a whole. 1/3 and 1/3 makes 2/3. If this is 2/3, what do I need to make it a whole? I would need 1/3 to make it a whole. 3/3 makes a whole. 1/4 and 1/4 and 1/4 equals 3/4. If this is 3/4, what would I need to make it a whole? I would need 1/4 to make this a whole. 4/4 make a whole. All the groups do not have the same number of pieces. The fourths have the most because it takes 4/4 to make 1 whole. The halves have the least because it only takes 2 halves to make a whole. The halves have bigger pieces, and the fourths have smaller pieces. Thirds are bigger than fourths, but smaller than halves. I have 1/4. I need 3 more fourths to complete the whole rectangle. Let's practice. For parts A, C, and E, identify the shaded area. So if I have my circle and it is partitioned into two sections. That means it's partitioned or divided into halves. And I have 1/2 shaded. The second one, I have the same shape and it is partitioned into two as well. Both sides are shaded, so that means that I have 2/2 shaded. Let's move on to thirds. Notice how each of these shapes are the same size and partitioned into thirds. So let's look at the first one. There is only one part shaded, so that means that we have 1/3 shaded. In the second one, we have 2 parts shaded. That means that we have 2/3 shaded. In the third one, we have 3 parts shaded, which means we have 3/3 shaded, or 1 whole. Let's move on to fourths. In this first one, I have 1 part shaded, so that means I have a 1/4 shaded. In the second one, I have 4 parts shaded. That means I have 4/4 shaded, or 1 whole. In the third one, I have 2 parts shaded. That means I have 2/4 shaded. And the last one, in this one, I have 3 parts shaded, which means I have 3/4 shaded. Moving on, what fraction do you need to color so that 1 whole is shaded? A, this shape is partitioned into thirds. There's only 1/3 shaded, so that means I need to shade in 2/3 to make 1 whole. 2/3 plus 1/3 is 3/3, or 1 whole. B, this shape is partitioned into halves. There's only 1/2 shaded, so I need to shade in 1 more half. 2/2 equals 1 whole. Let's look at C. C is partitioned into fourths. There are 2/4 shaded, so I need to shade in 2 more fourths. 4/4 equals 1 whole. D is partitioned into 3 sections. There are 2 parts shaded in, which means I need to shade in 1 more. 2/3 plus 1/3 equals 3/3. 3/3 equals 1 whole. E is partitioned into 2 parts, which means it's partitioned into halves. There's only 1/2 shaded, so that means I need to shade in 1 other half, which equals 1 whole. F is partitioned into fourths as well, and there are 3/4 shaded. So that means I need to shade in 1 more fourth to get 4/4 or 1 whole. Great job, everybody. Don't forget to go watch Miss Gullett's video and do your work. See you guys next week. Bye.